I always enjoy the obituary. It's great to be with you. Thank everybody for your great support of our agricultural industry across Arkansas. There isn't something more important in our state than what you do every day, and thanks for taking time away from your businesses to collaborate today and listen to policy talks and make sure that your elected officials are trying to head in the right direction. So thanks for the invitation. You know, I really enjoyed one of the great tributes to agriculture over the years was Paul Harvey's famous talk back in 1978 about God looked down and as he planned paradise and said, I need a caretaker, so he made a farmer. And I think all of you relate to that, and it's something that always makes me smile. But in our rural areas of the country, farmers are more than just those that produce the protein and the crops that we need for not only our society but for the world. But they're also the people that serve on school boards and serve on bank boards and serve on church vestries and help keep our communities alive and thriving and growing out in rural America. So thanks for all that you do. The pollen's already got me, so I'll be having several Marco Rubio moments with my water bottle. You know, Arkansas we're number one in rice and second in broilers and third in cotton, catfish, and turkey, fifth in timber, 10 in soybeans and sorghum. And while that's important and something that you all know, it made me think when I was looking at those stats how many of those parts of our ag industry I financed when I was involved with Delta Trust. We were headquartered down in Hamburg, so we were very involved in the agricultural community and the forestry community in Ashley and Chico County for the 16, 17 years that I had an investment in that company and was its CEO. And I remember vividly, and Randy's heard this story many times, but when I bought into that bank with my group back in the spring of 1999, we had 24 catfish farmers in Ashley and Chico County, and I think when we sold Delta Trust to Simmons in 2014, I think we were down to one due to both failures of government policy and the difficult business. Today I want to talk a little bit about the economy, about the budget situation in Washington, talk about the Financial Services Committee work that I do and how that relates to agriculture, particularly as it relates to financing in our community banks across the state. And then I want to talk about trade, and then I'll be happy to respond to any questions that you have. As Randy has made all the news cycles in Arkansas with his remarks yesterday, you don't need to know about the reductions in farm profits this year. And that's been a big impact on the industry and the banking industry, something that all of us in finance and those of you in the production business know very well. We know about the cycle. We know how difficult it is to get through. And that's just one of the challenges that we have in this part of where we are in the economic cycle. Our economy has supposedly been, advancing since the spring of 2009 when the recession or the Great Recession officially ended. But when I look at the statistics and then I look at the real world, I see a disconnect. And I think that's what accounts for a lot of the unrest in our electorate this year as they consider who they're going to vote for and who they're going to support. We're at 4.9% unemployment rate, which is excellent. I mean, the problem is that you don't feel that excellence universally. And when I look at the Arkansas 2nd Congressional District, I have 7 counties in the center part of the state, some rural like Perry, which is mostly national forest, and some very urban like Pulaski, Little Rock. There are only 1,500 more people employed in the 2nd Congressional District as of December as compared to July 2007. Wow, been a lot of graduations from high school and college since July of 2007, but the actual number of people employed is only that modest amount. And the same is true in the workforce, which is something that we all talk about because this speaks to the heart of American productivity. We've got 16 people that are unemployed or underemployed, and that's a lot. So yes, we've had an advance, but it's been anemic. It's been in that 2% range. And so economists say there are really about 7 million more jobs that should have been created in this past 7 or so years that haven't. And that's where that slack in the economy is, I think, creating this anxiety about the lack of opportunity to start a business or expand a business, despite the fact that the official unemployment rate has dropped to 4.9% because of people stepping out of the workforce. Labor participation rate, which I referred to, is bad in Arkansas. It's worse than the national average, and the national average is as low as it was the year that Star Wars came out, 1977, since everybody's on a Star Wars kick. And 93% of our counties in the U.S. have not fully recovered from the recession. 93% of U.S. counties have not fully recovered from the recession. So these are the kinds of things that we're facing with in Congress with a $19 trillion debt and growing. So we have budget pressure. We have low economic growth. The two are very linked. If you have a robust economy, you have more rapidly growing revenues, and you have smaller deficits, and therefore you pile up lower debt. So why is it that we have this kind of economic picture? I frequently challenge some of my friends on in the friendly opposition party. If we have zero interest rates, the most accommodative monetary policy in American history, certainly since the formation of the Federal Reserve, 1913. So we have zero interest rates. We have a $4 trillion liquidity basis on the Federal Reserve's balance sheet, up from about $900 billion before the crisis. And we have deficits, budget deficits in this country, smaller since the Republicans took control of the Congress, but nonetheless, we still have budget deficits. We ought to be in some sort of a Keynesian nirvana of economic growth, but we're not. So that's why I argue consistently that I think it's the non-monetary policy, so not the Fed, structural impediments that our economy faces that are prohibiting faster growth. And you talked about regulatory policy when I was walking in the room, and I'm going to reflect on that in a few minutes because I think that's one of the key non-monetary policy structural impediments to faster economic growth. But before I turn to regulatory policy, I want to kind of lead into it by talking about my work on the Financial Services Committee and talk about our capital markets and our banking. I've spent 35 years in business, and most of those years were in community banking. At First Commercial Bank, now part of Regions, with Stanley Hill. We were together in the early 90s at First Commercial, a bank I worked for its predecessor back when I was in high school and college. And then Delta Trust, a company I started in 1999. So the bulk of my career has been in community banking, helping people start restaurants, finance a crop, start a business, build a house, build a residential community. And so that's kind of been my world, my adult world. I've been an investment banker, true, and raised equity and done mergers and acquisitions and worked for great big banks as well in my career. But the core has been what we think of as a hometown community bank. And that group of people who run our banks and our communities are under siege right now. And they probably feel like a lot of you about the price you're getting for rice this season or beans. There were 1,500 fewer banks at the end of 2015 than in 2010 when Dodd-Frank passed. So we've lost 1,500 banks since the summer of 2010 when Dodd-Frank was passed, losing almost a bank a day, when in the 3 decades before we passed Dodd-Frank, an average of 100 banks opened a year. And we've only opened, I think, had maybe 3 new charters in the last 2 or 3 years. And that tells me that, banking is not an attractive business, is what that tells me. I mean, it's kind of think about common sense here. People are exiting the business and new market entrants aren't entering. That's really not good for our economies because our banks are a reflection of our own economic success. You show me a great bank, I'll show you a good local economy. You show me a struggling bank, I'll show you a struggling local economy. Harvard, knowers of all things, did a study last year, and it said the market share of community banks is declining twice as fast post-Dodd-Frank as pre-Dodd-Frank. And as I've said publicly, the CFPB, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, I know you're all feeling substantially better protected, is the most unnecessary, redundant federal agency ever created. I have never, in my 35 years of being out in the financial business, ever seen a Securities and Exchange Commissioner, Insurance Commissioner, bank regulator, state bank regulator, Federal Reserve person ever shirk their consumer protection responsibility under federal or state statute. Never. I just haven't done it. And some of you probably are bank directors or have been in the past or advisory directors, and you know what I'm talking about. But this organization is not on appropriations. It's not subject to the power of the purse and the Congress. It has a single director that cannot be fired except for essentially a fairly high recklessness standard, and it can only be fired by the President of the United States. The organization gets a set percentage of the income of the Federal Reserve, statutorily set. And so trying to regulate this or oversee this, provide oversight in our committee has been very challenging. Examples. Statutorily, the CFPB was told they could not regulate auto finance, auto dealers. And in the last 2 years, they've had major settlements as they have sued Honda Finance and Ally Finance for auto finance allegations by the CFPB, which they're specifically said they're not supposed to deal with. And they were found in an investigation by our committee to have done that inaccurately. Something that if any of us had done that in our business or in a bank, you would probably have a federal crime potentially. So the current regulatory environment is harming customers because of this, in my view, incredible burden being put on our small banks. Our community banking system is what makes the majority of ag loans in the country. There's some famous ag banks, and some of you know them, and those of you who have bigger operations or know of, like Rabo Bank out of, I guess it's a Dutch bank, and they've got offices in St. Louis, and they're a big, famous international ag lender, but over half the small business loans are in community banks. More than half of the commercial real estate loans are in small community banks. And so as we add this set of regulatory taxes on our community bank system post-Dodd-Frank, on top of all the existing regulations, we're getting less credit, we're getting less access to credit, we're getting less, particularly, innovation in banks. Something I had a lot of fun with at Delta Trust was trying to come up with new product ideas and would roll them out to the market. You know, I read the current statute, I read the regulations, and I'd roll a product out. I didn't ask anybody's permission to do that. And that's gotten extremely challenging now. 58% of banks have held off or canceled the launch of new products, according to a new ABA study, due to regulatory costs or risk. 44% of banks have been forced to reduce existing consumer products due to compliance burden. And a couple of my favorite examples are the qualified mortgage rules that were in Dodd-Frank, which was an effort to get at some of the poor mortgage standards that Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac and bankers were exhibiting, now has gone overboard and has really made it difficult for a lot of working families to qualify for a mortgage. You're essentially forcing them out of the banking market then. And we passed in the bill an effort to exempt manufactured housing from this high-cost mortgage rule that was part of Dodd-Frank. And I made the talk in the House committee. I said, maybe you've never lived in a rural county. But there aren't stick-built, builders out in rural counties that are putting up subdivisions. And for a lot of people, the nicest, slickest home that a young couple may get would be a very nice manufactured home that's put out on a piece of property deeded by their dad or their granddad or some arrangement like that. But a manufactured home loan, as you know, is not considered a real estate loan, and so it carries a little higher interest rate. And the opposition party wanted to essentially ban those loans or cap the interest rates, then cutting off manufactured housing lending by any community bank. Fortunately, we were able to, in the House, beat that back, and hopefully we'll get action out of the Senate. It's the exact kind of non-common sense, non-real world example that happens in Washington, D.C. every single time, every single day and time. And then something that's concerned me as a small town banker is now about 1 out of every 5 U.S. counties doesn't have a bank in it. And we may at 31,000 banks back when I started my career, might have had too many potentially, but certainly when you have 1 out of 5 counties not having any financial institution, that's a problem. Is Bank America going to open a branch in Eudora? I don't think so. And what we've done through regulation is we are forcing people out of the banking system and into the non-bank sector like payday lending and things of that nature. Well, I don't want to dwell too much on non-bank regulatory burden, except to say that it's a concern to me. I know you're going to hear from the other members of our delegation. You got Rick Crawford coming and others, and they'll talk about regulation in their own committee environments. I'm sure Bruce will talk to you a little bit about natural resources regulation with the EPA since he's on the Natural Resources Committee. But I want you thinking about the role of the Farm Bureau nationally and locally in regulatory policy. Too many times, corporate America, of which Farm Bureau is a prime participant, don't get aggressive in these rulemaking arenas. And we'll get letters to the Federal Register about a proposed rulemaking that says, well, if you just change this and that, you know, we can live with this rule. And what you're doing, not per se the Farm Bureau, but when one does that, you're essentially ceding the authority once again to the big unelected administrative state out there, saying that, well, it'll all be okay. And the people who can cope with that are the biggest companies in our country. But the people who are entrepreneurs, startup businesses, small farmers, small bankers, small manufacturers, they cannot keep pace with this regulatory burden. And to me, it is the leading non-monetary policy structural burden holding back economic growth in our country. During the campaign, I called it the wet blanket of the regulatory state. And there's a great book written about that called Rule of Nobody. And it is so indicative, meaning there's just so many checklists that people have to go through that they can't do their work. We are taking responsibility away from that line manager, that nurse in the OR, that bank loan officer, and we're just deferring to this rule of nobody, this checklist, this safe harbor that is so hard to train on, so hard to cope with. And so I think that we have to have a complete new look at how we do regulatory policy. And the House of Representatives passed the REINS Act, which I assume you know about, and if you don't, the REINS Act simply says any agency that puts forward a rule that's going to cost the American economy more than $100 billion a year, they have to bring that rulemaking back for approval to the House and Senate. We have ceded so much authority to this administrative state. The REINS Act, pull the reins back and let the people's elected representatives have a final say on these out-of-control rulemakings. I support that effort, and it passed the House. Tax reform is big. I don't want to dwell on it in detail, but it's, again, one of the non-monetary policy structural impediments, I think, to faster economic growth. I was pleased at the end of the year that we made a down payment on tax reform by passing the tax extender bill, which made 20 tax relief provisions permanent, including Section 179 small business expensing provisions. The R&D tax credit was made permanent. And by doing that, that will allow us, when the Congress takes up comprehensive tax reform, to do it much easier by clearing the deck of some of those perennial tax extenders that have just been extended for 1 or 5 years at a time. When I worked at the Treasury during Bush 41's administration, I'm pretty sure that the number of tax extenders and things like that were just a handful. The only one I can actually remember from those days was the R&D tax credit. And now there's something like 78 or 80 temporary tax provisions that have to rely on Congress's extension. And a lot of those were cleaned up in this bill that passed and President Obama signed in December. It's very hard to plan in a capital-intensive industry like agriculture or banking if you don't have permanent knowledge about what your tax planning horizon is. Very difficult, very challenging. And so I hope that in comprehensive tax reform we can make more progress on that with a new president, including further reductions or repeal of the estate tax. I want to make a couple of comments on the national security situation and then turn to trade, because I know you've got Ambassador Vetter today and I want to touch on trade. Something I've learned a lot about and spent a lot of time on since I entered the Congress is getting a handle on our national security strategy, particularly as it relates to interdicting and stopping terrorism. And my big concern in the past year, my first year in Congress, was our Iranian agreement, which I did not support because I felt like it was a very poor structured agreement and would actually lead to more finance of terror by freeing up Iranian frozen accounts, which the public number is about 100 billion, and then get them back into the world trading system, access to trade credit, access to the SWIFT system, which is the international wire transfer system. Not only the country of Iran and private actors in Iran, but all of their paramilitary organization and Quds Force entities are all back in the trading system, which seems to me to be counter to our own national security. And we did not address reparations. There are $45 billion of claims on Americans in U.S. courts since 1979 of damage to American citizens by the Iranians since the takeover of our embassy in 1979, including Beirut, Tel Aviv bus attacks, and that was not even on the agenda to get that money settled, $45 billion. And when George W. Bush took the nuclear arms out of Libya and basically disarmed Libya with Gaddafi's help after 9/11, one of the contingencies that Bush had was, I want you to pay all the money you owe to the victims of Lockerbie, and that had been adjudicated in courts. And Gaddafi did it. But we didn't even ask Iran for that. We didn't prohibit Iran from not buying ballistic missile technology. And during the height of the negotiations, Iran bought missiles and were delivered from Russia to Iran in just a blind attack against the negotiations, which we said very little about. And finally, we have American citizens in Iran, and we did nothing before the negotiations to deal with that. So to me, the negotiation, we didn't get as much as we should have. And then as an old banker who's worked out a lot of loans over my career, you don't ever give everybody their money back on day one. We should have released those sanctions based on Iran's commitment to the international world and international trade and rules of engagement over time. And we should have unfrozen those accounts over time. But instead, we gave them all they wanted, and we didn't get what we wanted. Last national security comment I want to make is we have just celebrated the 5th anniversary of the chaos in Syria. Yeah, it's been 5 years. And we missed opportunity after opportunity to demonstrate leadership in this administration to forestall what has become the largest refugee crisis since World War II, and we have abdicated our leadership every chance we've had by referring to ISIS as a JV team, by drawing a red line and then not delivering on the red line. And now we have burdened Turkey, Jordan, and Western Europe with, upwards of a couple of million people, and 250,000 people have been murdered in Syria. And that was the birthplace of al-Zakari's attempt to reconstitute al-Qaeda as ISIS, blow out of eastern Syria into all of northern Iraq, and we are so tangled up in fighting something that I think we could have headed off. And so I am hopeful that we will get a president elected this fall that will work with Congress and create a national security strategy that will keep this country safe, keep our homeland safe, and build a kind of coalition that will defeat ISIS and engage our Arab Sunni colleagues to hold those countries and try to create a better sense of reform. But the next president is inheriting a substantial mess, in my view. Let me turn to trade, and then I'll conclude, and if there are questions, be happy to respond. I want to thank Randy Veach at the top for co-writing with me a op-ed in Arkansas about what Trade Promotion Authority means for our state. I have never been around a topic, and I'm sure you have in your coffee shops and in church and at Rotary, dealt with this same thing. I have never heard so much misinformation about trade as I've heard in the last year. And it's from all sides. So those of you who are loyal Democrats, you've got it. Those of you who are loyal Republicans, you've got it. And it's a bunch of misinformation. And it is disturbing. And I want to remind people, and Randy tries to do this as well, 340,000 jobs in this state are dependent on trade. And we exported over almost $9 billion of goods and $2 billion in services. And that's about almost 10% of the state GDP of this state. And yet we're going to rail against passing Trade Promotion Authority, which is one of the most essential things that we can have in the Congress as it relates to reining in the executive. Before FDR, before President Roosevelt, our country, and before the income tax was upheld by the Supreme Court, one of the sad days in American history, before World War I, our country was a developing nation, and we had a high tariff. And Congress set those tariffs, and Congress, after doing it between 1789 and about 1920, said, man, I've had enough of this. I can't stand having these individual tariff discussions every day with my constituents. We're going to grant that authority pursuant to a law in Congress to the executive. And under a set of rules, let them negotiate trade treaties, set tariffs in those treaties, and then Congress, through its advice and consent process, can approve that treaty or not over in the Senate. And so that's what we've basically lived with since FDR was president. So it's essential that if Congress wants to oversee the trade process of this country, make sure it's fair, make sure markets are open, make sure the rules benefit all the American citizens, then you have to have Trade Promotion Authority. And it passed the Congress with bipartisan support, but it was hard work. It's hard work to remind Americans how important trade is to our economic future. But by passing Trade Promotion Authority, and thank you for your help on that, that now allows Congress to potentially consider the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which you'll hear more about from Ambassador Vitter, and the emerging agreement over in Europe. But there's a lot to be done on those. I mean, this is a million words and 5,000 pages, Trans-Pacific. So everyone is just now studying it and trying to understand the benefits from it. And what I've heard from the protein industry, the beef and pork folks, and I've heard a lot of concerns about TTIP from the rice industry. I've heard that from even the financial services, not TTIP, PP from the financial services industry. So I'm looking forward to spending a lot of time over the balance of this year understanding Trans-Pacific Partnership, reading it, hearing from industry about the benefits of it. And I look forward to seeing Ambassador Vetter later today and have a chance to visit on that topic in more detail on the agricultural provisions. Your ideas and interest are, of course, always welcome. And finally, we have to talk about the subject of the President's most recent trip down to Cuba. And once again, I think we are seeing the beginning of the opening in Cuba that will lead to a better integration economically of Cuba with the United States. As I've said to you, many of you, this is going to take time to do that. It's going to be hard work. It's not a lay down to do that, but I appreciate Congressman Crawford and Senator Bozeman particularly being engaged on this topic, focused on it, and they have been very important inside our delegation in talking about where we go. And just in the last 24 hours, Fidel Castro denounced Obama's visit to Cuba and wrote an op-ed, a 1,500-word op-ed that I struggled through late yesterday. Brother Obama is the name of it. It's great reading. I recommend it to you. But it demonstrates to us that we have got to get the pressure on Cuba to offer freedom of expression, freedom of religion, entrepreneurship, for our American businesses to go down there and open up a port terminal or open up a Marriott hotel. They've got to be able to employ those people and incent those people directly, not pay somebody in the labor bureau in Havana and have them skim all the money off and give the employees in Cuba just a few pennies. And we need to make sure that the Castro brothers know that we're not going to take continued intimidation of the people of Cuba. And we need to have all the people who owned farms and businesses and rum distilleries whose property were stolen from them in the 1950s. We need a plan, a reparation plan, to make sure that they have their right to the rule of law and private property as Cuba opens. So the great opportunity for us is rice. I think we need to keep our eye on the prize of replacing Vietnam as their leading supplier. And that will be a great future for us as the largest producer and so ably and well geographically located to serve that market. Thanks for inviting me today. I see Congressman Crawford's here, my great colleague, and I love serving with him, and we're so blessed to have him on our Agriculture Committee. I appreciate the invitation. If we have time for a question or two, I'd be happy to take them. Thank you so much. Everybody want a stretch break? Yes, sir.
Congressman, you mentioned the act that you're working on about if a proposal affects the economy to the tune of, did you say $100 billion? $100 billion, that it has to come back to Congress. Yeah. Does that not speak to the overall problem? I mean, if something's going to affect the economy by $10 billion, why shouldn't Congress be looking at it?
Well, there's a standard out there in the regulatory policy world that right now statutorily the Congress years ago, I'm not sure if it was in the Bush administration, Rick might remember, established what is a major rule. And the definition of a major rule, not inflation adjusted, is that $100 billion impact. You can have a very small rule like the Department of Labor fiduciary rule on financial advisors. It doesn't have a $100 billion regulatory cost impact, but it's going to disrupt and take consumer options away from people all over this country. And you'll see Edward D. Jones' offices probably shut down because of it, because it goes right at the heart of raising costs and removing consumer choice from lower net worth young people and lower net worth savers. You've got the Department of Labor overtime rules, which I've got an op-ed I think will be in the paper this week about that. 250,000 people wrote the Department of Labor saying this is a bad idea. And guess what? The old gang at 1600 Pennsylvania doubled down. Hey, we love bad ideas. Let's put this out as soon as possible. I've never heard of somebody writing the Federal Register a comment. 250,000 comments. Somebody may have a bigger one, but that's big. So that's where we got the $100 billion number. I wish it was $1, but it's not. It's major rules. The House Republican Conference was enthusiastic about this. We got some Democratic support as well, that major rules, if they have a $100 billion impact, would come back to Congress for a final approval, called the REINS Act, and I encourage you to go read about it. Anybody else? Stump the congressman down? Are you smarter than a fifth grade congressman? Thanks for having me. Hope you have a great day. Thanks.
Congressman, thank you. Congressman, I wanted to say thank you for all that you do for us. We appreciate and understand, and we know and realize that you're doing everything you can to keep agriculture strong, and not only agriculture, but all the industry that's in our state. And we really, really appreciate that, and you represent us very well. Thank you so much for all that you do.